Okay, so welcome back to uh, Reliability of the Scriptures, lesson 1, or sorry, not lesson 1, lesson 12. Welcome back to the Reliability of the Scriptures, lesson 12. We're going to be going through the period of the Exodus today, but we want to go back and review some of what we talked about last time when we were looking at the United Monarchy period and the conquest. So we talked about Solomon's temple, right? And there's no archaeological evidence of Solomon's temple directly that we have. It was destroyed, it was replaced, rebuilt, and then that was expanded and rebuilt, and then the site was built upon by numerous groups for hundreds of years until the Muslims built some mosques there, and they've rebuilt the mosques that are on top of that multiple times. So for the last 3,000 years, a lot has changed in that location. But the description that we find in the Bible, it does fit very well with other temples that we do know of from that time period, that we do have archaeological evidence of. Not just in Judea, well, there wasn't any other temple in Judea at that time, but in Egypt, in Ugarit, in Syria, in the Hittite area, all these places had similarly constructed temples, similar size, similar layout. So Solomon's was quite average in the general dimensions and such. But his building projects also, right? We saw that they're normal sorts of things that were going on at that time. There's going to be some expansion in architecture and expansion in things whenever you have a growing kingdom like that. But the revenues of grain and gold and things that he were getting in were not unreasonable compared to some other countries. There might be other places that got more grain, less gold, or vice versa. But it puts Solomon's works in the realm of reality, right? Not fantasy. Even with the inside covered with gold and his chairs and all of these things, Egypt was not too far off of that. And again, the close connection between the sacking of Jerusalem in one year and then just about half a decade later, all of this gold being donated to the temples of Egypt by the next pharaoh is very suspicious. Where did he get all that gold from? Well, the Bible gives us the answer. Now, when we go back and look at the beginning of Israel in the land of Canaan, we know that Israel was there at least by 1210 BC, right? They are mentioned on the Israel stele or the Marintha stele. They're there in Canaan at that time. So we can't have them any later than that, right? But they could be well earlier, right? The Bible actually gives a date around 1406. Now, I say gives a date. That's it's not obviously listed in the Old Testament as 1406 BC, but we get 480 years before the construction of the temple, and we can date Solomon's reign fairly consistently based on the kings after him and the entrance of Assyria and all that. And so that gives us a pretty good timeline around 1406 BC, and the Exodus about 40 years before that. So that's good dating, right? We also talked about the Amarna tablets, right? Interestingly, the Amarna tablets fit right in with this period of the 1400s BC, right? In the early 1300s. And we have this people called the Habiru coming into the land of Canaan, taking over control of parts of it, attacking many of the same cities that Joshua is dealing with. We get interactions with, we get alliances between people in the land, like the mayor of Shechem and the Habiru, just as we have alliances with the Gibeonites and the Israelites, right? And we saw that both the Gibeonites and the people in Shechem in various places in the scripture are called Hivites, so they might be related there. So that explains the lack of conflict in the central region of the land of Canaan. So a lot of overlap there, right? So it's very interesting to see that connection to the history. Now, we also pointed out that Joshua and the Israelites did not immediately occupy the land of Canaan, right? They crossed over, They camped at Gilgal, they went to Jericho, they came back to Gilgal, they went to Ai, they came back to Gilgal, they went to Gibeon and Ebal and came back to Gilgal, they did the southern areas and came back, they went to the north and came back. They surveyed all the land to divide it up for an inheritance. This is a multi-year kind of campaign that they're going on that would take quite some time. And even until Joshua chapter 18, there's still, most of the tribes are at Gilgal waiting for their allotment of inheritance. So they didn't just go in and fill the land right away and destroy everyone completely, as some people often think. That's what they were maybe commanded to do in some ways. But even the Bible says, God says, I'm going to drive them out little by little, right? So that the land is not just empty. And again, even after the inheritance is allotted, a lot of these areas were not going to be conquered even until David's time, or the end of David's reign and Solomon's reign, when they were able to secure control of all this. So it wasn't for 400 years after the conquest that a lot of these areas were really locked in to Israelite control. We see the book of Judges. It constantly passes back and forth. Again, sometimes Israel's living in caves. They're not city dwellers for the most part. So this is what we have to think about. What does the Bible actually say about what happened in Joshua's time in the Judges? Not what is our conception of it based on some stories that we've been told. Because a lot of times Bible stories like to get expanded. You hear all this stuff about Noah and the people that he argued with, and that mocked him, and all this stuff for all these years, for 100 years, and that it never rained until the ark was built. And none of that is in the story, right? These are all things that people have added in to kind of enhance the story from their understanding or their interpretation, but that's not what the Bible actually says. Same thing happens with Joshua and the conquest. Now, if we go to the period of the Judges, right? If we look, there's this time period. If we add up all the years mentioned in the book of Judges and the time of Joshua, so we go from Samuel all the way back to Joshua, there's too many years, right? There's about 600 years if every judge was just one right after the other, and all the peace times and all of this. So that's clearly too many for the 480 years that it says were between the crossing of the Jordan and the building of the temple. So we need to figure out, well, what can we do, right? How do we account for that? Well, there's a lot of overlap in some of these places, right? The judges, when you read their accounts, there's judges in the north, there's judges in the south, judges in the east and the west, and they're fighting all these different enemies, and some of them we don't even know maybe who they're fighting. So there's spaces for certain judges to overlap, right? And that will get our time down to about 480 years. I mean, you could maybe even compress it further than that if you wanted to, but it easily fits in the 480-year time period. Now, some scholars, though, don't accept that 480 years as an actual literal thing. They say, well, this is some kind of symbolism. They're trying to, speak about the importance of this event, and so there's 12 tribes, or maybe 12 generations of 40 years each. They look at kind of these symbolic numbers, and they try to use that as an example to really drastically shorten the period down. But if you consider 1 Chronicles 6:33, it goes through 19 generations of one family that occurred between the Exodus and the time of Solomon. And so, well, that's not 12, that's 19, right? That's more than 50% more. So this is not just 12 generations of 40 years each. That's just a kind of a fantasy. That's someone trying to come up with some reason to shift the Exodus to a different time period. Again, biblical dating, this idea of around 1400 BC is further confirmed by the statement of Jephthah. You look at the judge, there's a conflict between the people of Ammon and the Moabites wanting to get some land back that Israel's in control of. And Jephthah comes and he says, what are you guys doing, right? we've had this land for 300 years, right? How can you come and claim it now? Why didn't the king before you claim it? Why didn't the people before you claim it? Everyone knows we've lived here. Again, 300 years, that's a long time. You can't be saying this is your land, right? So, and if Jephthah's around 1100, you go back 300 years, voila, that's 1400. That's right about the time that they came in. Jephthah here is not being precise, right? He's not saying, oh, it's been 317 years to the day. It doesn't matter. He's just in the ballpark of 300 years. Give or take 20 years, that's fine. And we don't know exactly when Jephthah lived. His dates are a little uncertain because of the various ways it could overlap in the period of the Judges. But Jephthah's coming in near the end of the period of Judges, right? We're getting close to the time of Saul here, to the time of David, and so we're going to get more sure about the dates as we go along from that period. But these are two separate points in the Bible, two completely different stories that all point back to the same time period for the Exodus, right? But unfortunately, there's a lot of Bible scholars, scholars in general, archaeologists, they disagree about biblical dates, right? So it can be hard to find evidence in the ground, right? Because these guys are assuming that it happens in one period, and when they dig, they don't find anything there, right? And these guys over here are looking in a different period, and they're looking and say, oh, there's no evidence that anything happened during these 100 years. I like to joke sometimes about it. It's like, there's no evidence that these guys were here when you said that they weren't, right? We look back and we say, no, you're looking 200 years too late, or 100, you're looking at the wrong time. You're looking in the wrong place. Of course you're not going to find anything, right? And there are some other reasons that there's some difficulty about that sort of thing. Now, Kitchen, who wrote this on the reliability of the Old Testament, he has some reasonable dates for the later judges, right? Like Jephthah, Samson. But unfortunately, what he's trying to do is fit this period of the Judges into a much shorter period, where he gets down to the Israelites coming in around 1250 BC, just before this Merimta stele was made. And so he ends up compressing a lot of the earlier judges, like Ehud and Othniel and Deborah and Gideon, all these guys, he's compressed them into about 40 years, right? When, in fact, they extend back, 200 years almost. And so it's a little odd, but he kind of disregards the statement of Jephthah. He doesn't just view it as, okay, he's not very precise. He said he's just exaggerating, right? And he's, saying that, it's actually 150 years, but he's saying 300, right? Well, why would he do that, right? That doesn't quite make any sense. He's trying to prove that they've been in control of this place for a long time and disregarding their argument. Overstating the claim is not gonna do that. But there are some good reasons to note that Israel had moved into Canaan, right? And we can see in the archaeological record, if you go to places near Shiloh or near Mount Ebal in the central highland region of Canaan, they don't find any pig bones in the remains that they find. They go in, they find there's bones that had been buried and where people had been eating and sacrificing all these animals and that sort of thing. But there's no pig bones there, right? Which matches up with the Israelite practice of not eating pigs. But if you go to the Philistine areas, right, you find pig bones, right? So over here you've got sheep and goat and deer. Over here you've got pigs and probably some sheep and other things as well. But there's this cultural difference, right? Some sort of religious difference between these two areas. So that kind of summarizes the evidence that we have for the period of the Judges, right? We don't have any direct evidence from that time except these bones that we find for different animals, showing that there was a different kind of people group living in this area, right? We have the Merimta stele in about 1210 that shows Israel is living in this area. So But other than that, we don't have a lot of direct evidence, right? We know they weren't writing a lot of things at that time. We don't have written records. There wasn't a massive kingdom or anything in that area. So what else do we have? Again, we do have the Amarna tablets that we talked about in the time of the conquest. But the Amarna tablets, again, some people aren't going to accept those. They don't give us a whole lot of information, but they do give us some insights and some connections to the biblical story. Now, we need to go back and talk about Egypt and the Exodus, right? Because the period of the Exodus is one of the most important periods in Israelite history, right? This is everything throughout the Old Testament references back to that event, right? I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt, right? I'm the God that brought you out on eagle's wings, right? Out of the iron smelting furnace, right? Time and time again, God is the one who brought them out of Egypt, right? Out of the land of slavery. And so if that didn't happen, then what is the Old Testament? It's just a fairy tale, right? But archaeologists very commonly reject the idea of the Exodus, right? Because they say, well, there's no evidence that the Hebrews were there. There's no evidence that they went out, right? And this kind of reasoning is often based on some poor assumptions, right? It also often ignores the biblical text, and there's many arguments that are made from silence. Oh, yeah, we don't have any evidence of this. Okay, well, do we have any evidence against it, right? That's a different question. The particular issue when you go and you look at the land of Goshen, right? People will say, well, there's no written records from that time that show that the Hebrews were in the land of Goshen, right? In the eastern Nile Delta. Okay, that's true, right? We don't have any written records from 3,500 years ago about that. But what records do we have from that place? Well, it turns out we don't have any surviving records from that area, right? Of any kind, right? There's no written records from the Delta area, at least the eastern Delta area, right? So it's a floodplain. Every year, the Nile floods. They do farming there. There's all sorts of stuff that the whole massive areas flood. If there's a major flood, it's going to flood buildings and all sorts of things. Mud brick structures. This is what the Israelites were building, right? They're building store cities out of mud brick. What happens when mud brick gets wet over and over again? Eventually, it's going to turn back into mud, right? And it's just going to disappear into the ground, right? There's going to be no trace of it at all. It's just literally mud and straw. It's going to break down. If you bring in stone from the south, there's no stone in the river delta, right? There's no source of stone there. They have to bring stone from quarries way in the south of Egypt, and they would float it up the Nile, and they could build some of these temples and more permanent buildings. But over the course of thousands of years, buildings collapse. Buildings get rebuilt, right? Stone gets repurposed. Old inscriptions get scraped off. New inscriptions get put on. It might be recycled many, many times. Not just by these old Egyptian pharaohs, but then you get into the Greek period and the Seleucids, and they're doing things, and then you get into the Roman period, and they're doing things, and then the Muslims come in, and they might destroy all sorts of things. Things get into disrepair, sink into the mud. You might never find it. Papyrus rots away. So there's no records. There's no records really of anybody there. We go in and we find we found a city of Aris, right? This city that is underneath where Ramses was, right where the Bible says the Israelites were. And there's this strange group of people there. There's this really bizarre building and this guy that looks like a Semitic guy that was some kind of special ruler, had a pyramid burial place, all this stuff that it looks like, well, that could be Joseph, right? It all fits with the biblical story, but we don't have any inscriptions, we don't have any writing about it, we don't know who these people are. And so, well, there's no evidence. Well, there's no evidence of anything else. There's no evidence against it, right? Everything's just mostly been gone. because of the area itself. We wouldn't expect any evidence to come from that place. And if there was an exodus, if Egypt lost this major military, thing in the Red Sea and all this stuff, they're not going to monumentalize their defeat. They're not going to carve it in stone. This day we lost, thousands and thousands of slaves. They just up and left, or they're lamenting all the plagues that hit them and all this. There can't possibly be any direct evidence of the Exodus, right? So people say, "Oh, there's no evidence." Well, we wouldn't expect any evidence, right? Not from the area, not from the subject matter. They're not going to want to record that in their own history. So why would we expect to see anything about it at all? We wouldn't, and so we don't. Not seeing anything about it is not evidence against it. But there is a lot of implicit evidence, right? Not explicit, but implicit evidence for the biblical account. One is that it was only in the time of the New Kingdom, or the New Kingdom started about 1570 and went until 1170 BC. It was only at that time that foreign labor for building projects started being practiced in the land of Egypt. If you're in the older kingdom before that, or the Middle Kingdom, I don't remember exactly what it was called in the 1600s BC, but they didn't do that, right? They used local labor for that. But now they're starting to go out, do these raids, getting Syrians, getting people from other countries and bringing them in and using slave labor. And look at the dates, right? If we're expecting the Exodus is around 1440, right? You go back however much time Israel was in Egypt, right? Go back to the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, right? So we got Joseph coming into the land in a time when they weren't using foreign labor, right? And we see that in the story of Exodus, right? Joseph is there. Everyone's fine during Joseph's time, and even sometime after Joseph dies. But sometime later, in the intervening centuries, new Pharaoh comes to power. They enslave the Israelites, and that starts this thing. And that fits exactly with the timing that we see here. 100 and something years before the Exodus, Israel starts getting enslaved, right? They start using slaves for these building projects. And this is the time period that they're going to do it in, right? They didn't do it later. They weren't making these big projects later on. They did it in the very time period that we're considering for the Exodus, right? Then there's this interesting picture, and we think we talk about this in Can We Believe the Bible, or Archaeology in the Bible. This is an image from the tomb of the Vizier Rickmeyer. Now this guy was a vizier about 1450 BC, right? Circa 1450 BC. Remember, we said the Exodus is going to be 1446, right? That's the best estimate for the date of the Exodus. So this is just 4 years before the date of the Exodus. And what do we see? Foreign slaves making bricks for the temple of Amun at Karnak in Thebes. Now, these are not Israelites, right? No one's saying that these are Israelites doing this. I believe they are Semitic, maybe Syrian, I think is the idea, that these are some Syrian slaves. I don't know if that's written somewhere in and around this, that these were Syrians doing that. But it shows slaves, foreign slaves, doing the exact work that the Bible describes the Israelite slaves doing at the exact time that the Bible says that the Israelites were doing it, right? And so we've got to wonder, well, wow, right? Now, this is not the place that the Israelites were at. This is at Karnak. The Israelites were further north in the other valley, and said to be building store cities, not temples. But were they only building store cities? Did they do other things? What sort of things were they involved in? I don't know, right? But it's just amazing to me that this picture comes from exactly the time of the Exodus, right? This would be while Moses is a shepherd in Midian. This is what's going on in Egypt, right? um, the exact thing that we're talking about. Just it boggles the mind, right? And yet, there's no evidence. Well, there's evidence of other foreign slaves there doing the same thing that they said they were doing. So the Bible account is not very far-fetched in this aspect. And if we fast forward a bit to the time of Ramses, right, in 1275, so this would be about 175 years after the Exodus. We get records of stable masters, right? So these are guys, they're building stables for Ramses, for his horses and things like that, and they have quotas for making 2,000 bricks per day, right? So there are records recorded of the quota system, just like we see in the biblical account, right? Now, again, this is later on, okay, granted, but if you're like someone like Kitchen and you believe that the Exodus happened later on, well, then, man, this matches exactly with what the Bible says, right? It's just that maybe the dates are a little bit off. But it's the same kind of thing. And we see a multi-structure where there's Egyptian masters over foreign foremen, right? The slaves have a level above them, right, that are of their own race, and then the slaves down at the bottom doing all the work, right? So there's foremen, there's amounts for the straw that they were supposed to add in, right? So again, the very thing that we see in the Bible of the restriction of the straw, and they have to go get their own straw and still meet their quotas. These are the same kinds of things we see in the records of Ramses II. There's even detailed work records regarding tomb construction at that time that mention getting days off for religious festivals, right? Getting days off to go and make offerings to your gods, right? So you can imagine this is exactly what Moses came and told Pharaoh, hey, please let us go and make a 3-day journey to offer sacrifices to our God in the wilderness, right? And you can imagine Pharaoh maybe, right, saying, what, another holiday, right? How much time do you guys need off, right? Because if they've got these various holidays that are being celebrated for all these other gods, the big complaint that Pharaoh makes is, who is the Lord, right? Who is this God you're going to go worship? I never heard of him before, right? He's not one of our gods, right? Why are you going to go have this festival to him, right? But in fact, there were lots of festivals that maybe they could have gone, and maybe they did. Remember you look at what Joshua talks about, and some of the things where choose for yourself who you're going to serve, right? Whether it was the gods of your forefathers worshipped in beyond the river, right? The gods of the Egyptians, the gods of the people of this land, right? They had worshipped other gods in Egypt. Some of them were continuing to do that. So this was not unheard of. This matches almost exactly with what we see in the biblical account. Again, this is a slightly different time period, but there's no reason to expect the same thing wasn't happening just 100 years or 200 years earlier, right? The same kind of we're in the middle of the same dynasties, right? Same sorts of things. So that part's not very far-fetched at all. It matches with what we would expect, the slavery aspect. Now, when we consider the plagues, right, when we look at what sort of things are described in the plagues, they're all real problems, right? They deal with fish, frogs, insects, cattle, people, weather. These are not fantasies, right? We're not talking about dragons coming down and genies appearing and all sorts of weird things, right? These are natural things interacting, right? Now it's presented in a very supernatural way, right? And as a punishment and a pestilence, and the proportion is very high, right? But they're normal everyday things, right? It's not fanciful, right? And they also are recorded as happening in a real place, right? In Egypt, in Goshen, or next to Goshen, or not in Goshen, as the different plagues are supposed to affect, right? It's not some unknown geography, just describing that one day in a faraway land, this such and such happened. No, it's written about what happened right here, right now, so we can have some assurance of that. And so, God, we know, often uses real world and natural forces to suit his purpose, right? To show his control, right? He uses weather. He uses storms and earthquakes and fire. And, he talks about sending the hornet to drive out the people, right? The locust coming in, or the quail coming in, or these natural sort of things that God uses, in addition to supernatural things like manna coming down and the Red Sea splitting open, right? And so there's all these ways in which it's grounded in reality, right? There is a supernatural aspect to it, right? But the story of the Exodus is grounded in real people in real time and in a real place, right? Now, we don't get the name of the Pharaoh in the Bible, right? But we can work it out from the dates. Now, there are some interesting theories about the natural causes for the plagues, right? I've heard some things about possibly volcanic eruption. You can see the cloud going up, a volcanic eruption, maybe on the island of Crete or something like that, that maybe put up some big cloud, darkened the sky, it sent a tidal wave or some kind of thing. There's ideas of blooms of red algae. Kitchen goes through that in his book, referencing back to a lady that had come up with some theories about the rising flood and bringing this silt in, and the color of the algae, and that killing fish, and that the dead fish causing anthrax or something, and all these different things happening, and frogs coming out, and different plagues breaking out because of these natural causes. And it's possible, right? But none of them quite fit the description of the events in Exodus, right? When you really get into some of these more natural theories, well, it's the wrong kind of algae, right? Or it's the wrong kind of bacteria that doesn't work that way. Or the water wouldn't have been red; it would have been brown, or whatever, right? There's the algae doesn't grow when there's a whole lot of stuff in it, when a really high flood year, right? So some things don't make sense that way, right? And it seems more, if you're willing to accept the supernatural, that God really did these things, right? Now, if you're not willing to accept the supernatural, though, some of these descriptions, they're enough to convince you that it's plausible, right? That this Exodus thing happened. Maybe it's a little bit legendary, but it's attached to some normal events. And some of these things were things that happen somewhat regularly, right? And they might have issues with frogs in certain years, or issues with hail, or locusts, right? They did, but it's the scale and the timing in the biblical account that really makes it special, right? And the purpose of it. Now, if we date the Pharaoh, right? This is another question that we have about the Exodus. Who was this Pharaoh, right? We don't know his name from the Bible, but if we take the date of 1446, then we get two possibilities, right? We have a third possibility if we want to take a different date. You want to move it to 1200 something. Maybe you could put it in the time of Ramses or something like that. And people like to do that. But that doesn't match what the Bible actually says. If we go back to 1446, we get two possibilities. And that's going to depend on the dating. They basically get the dates from writings where it says, we saw this particular star on this particular day, right? Come over the horizon, right? The rising of Sophis or something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but they'll figure out the rising from a certain place in Egypt. There were a few places where they would measure it, maybe at Memphis or at Thebes or at Elephantine or something like that. And so depending on which city they saw it from, right, that's going to change the timing, because that's the elevation and the latitude changes. And so it will shift the thing a few years depending on which way you think it might be. But you can adjust the Egyptian chronology by a few years, and you can come to the 18th year of Thutmose III, right? Thutmose III, in the 18th year of his reign, that would be the time of the Exodus. And that's an interesting date, because before that time, Thutmose III had made 17 annual war campaigns, right? Every year he had gone out and into Canaan or something like that, and had made these campaigns. But then all of a sudden they stop. Thutmose's reign continues on. He continues for several more years, but he's not raiding anymore. And that would match if his army was destroyed in the Red Sea, right? Or a large part of it, right? Now he's done with that. Also, there is a lot of destruction in Egypt. They've lost this big slave force. You're not going to be going out and doing this. You're trying to rebuild your country. So that's an interesting possibility. The other possibility, if you don't shift the chronology by a few years, or you kind of shift it the other way, you get Amenhotep II, right? Now, Amenhotep II was not a big military leader. He was a very weak king. And one of the theories with Amenhotep II is that he actually drowned in the Red Sea. And so these two different possibilities depend on your interpretation of the book of Psalms. I think it's Psalm 136 talks about Pharaoh and his army being overthrown in the sea, right? And so we ask, well, does that mean that they died in the sea? All of them? Or did Pharaoh live on? There's this question, right? So if you think that Pharaoh died, well, it can't possibly be Thutmose III because he kept on living, right? Now, granted, Amenhotep also kept on living, but there's a theory that this was a different Amenhotep. That the first Amenhotep died after some years. It was very weak, and he was replaced by the priests, who put in another guy and tried to give him the same name to make it seem like nothing had gone wrong. Now, I don't know about that theory. I like the Thutmose's theory a bit more. Seems to make more sense. But it depends on this idea of the dating, and if you get the timing right. But these are the two candidates for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But the interesting thing is, either way, whichever one of these guys you end up with, Thutmose III, by the way, was succeeded by Amenhotep II. And Amenhotep II is not the firstborn. He's actually the secondborn, which is something that matches up with the biblical account again, right? That all the firstborn in Egypt died. And so Thutmose, his firstborn son, died, and his secondborn son became the king after him. That's an interesting point, right? But either way, whichever one it might be, when we come to thinking about Moses' mother, right, his adopted mother, who was Pharaoh's daughter, that seems to be Hatshepsut, the daughter of Thutmose I, right? So this is the famous queen of Egypt, who was actually a pharaoh of Egypt in her own right, but all her monuments were desecrated. They were defaced. Like, she was actually chipped out of the monument, and all the things that were written there were chipped off so that you couldn't read it anymore. So some later pharaoh went back and tried to basically remove all memory of her. And people have often speculated why, right? Why would someone go back and try to do this? And, part of one idea is that, oh, well, they didn't like that a woman had been pharaoh and they wanted to remove that, or she had tried to do some things. And possibly, right? I mean, if you don't have any better explanation. But with the biblical account, we have a pretty good explanation. right? I mean, imagine what would you do to try to erase the history of what happened, right? This lady had adopted Moses, right? Moses ended up leading this huge group of people out and bringing all these plagues on Egypt and all this other stuff. If Hatshepsut had not done that, Egypt would have been fine, right? They wouldn't have had all these problems. And so you could see some good motivation for trying to remove her from history, to remove this stuff about Moses and such from history as well. Now, when we talk about Egypt in the Exodus, there's a big question that archaeologists come to, and this is this issue of population, right? Because the Bible records 603,550 fighting men from age 20 years old and up, right? That came out with Moses. That does not include the Levites, and that does not include the women and the children, right? So if you add in the 22,000 something Levites, and you add in an equal number of women, and all the people under 20 years old, well, now you're looking at 2 million people, right? That's a really big group of people. Archaeologists will say that's far too many, right? When they go back and they estimate the population of Egypt, right? They estimate that the total population of Egypt at that time was about 3 to 4 million. And their estimate for the population of Canaan is only about 50 to 70,000, right? Now, I'm not entirely sure how those things are done. And I know in sometimes what they'll do is they'll kind of do a survey of looking at, there's different towns and they probably had a population of this, so we'll kind of multiply this and figure out how many people could have lived there. In some cases in Egypt, they're going to have actual records of official records, maybe from a census or something like that they can get an idea of how many people were there. But the number in the Bible gives them some concern, right? Because it is way higher than anything you would expect, right? That basically a third of the population of Egypt just up and left one day and then went into this land of Canaan. And that's one thing where we run into some other problems with the Bible, right? Because the book of Deuteronomy says that you're not this great nation, you're the smallest, you were the smallest, right? But if they're 2 million strong, well, that's a lot bigger than the Canaanites, right? That's a lot more than there were Canaanites. So that makes them a really big nation. So how do you interpret that verse in Deuteronomy in light of that? Assuming that what the Bible says is true, and assuming what we know about archaeology is true, they were a very big nation, right? So there's some difficulty there, right? Now, one common idea is to interpret these numbers a little bit differently. And one of them is that, see, the Bible says there were 603,550 men. Well, the word Eleph is used for 1,000, right? But it can also mean a clan, right? It can mean a kind of there's a couple of possibilities, either a clan or a leader of some kind. So some people say, well, okay, that's 603 clans, right, and 550 people. Now, it's not just that simple, right? The idea was that originally maybe the Bible said there were, say, 40 clans, right? And so 5,500 people, right, in one place. And so someone later on said, oh, okay, that's 40,000 and 5,000. And so they put that together as 45,000, right? So there was some confusion that basically the text at one point said clans and thousands, but then someone added that together because it was written the same way and they misunderstood it. That's possible, but that requires some interesting editing tricks and figuring out the math of that. Some people think it means like a troop, like in a battle, right? So you've got so many troops totaling so many men. And there's several different theories about how that could go together. But the problem is when you do that, the census numbers don't really add up in any meaningful way, right? If we think of clans instead of thousands, it doesn't work. And if you go over to Numbers chapter 3, verse 39, and you look at Exodus chapter 38, verse 24 and following, there's mention of a 5 shekel tax, right? The firstborn had to pay a 5 shekel tax, right? All the fighting men had to pay a half shekel tax. Anytime there's a census, all the fighting men have to pay this half shekel tax. And it totals up how much money was collected, right? So if someone just accidentally made a mistake combining the thousands over here, then in Numbers and Exodus, you're going to have the wrong number for the total, right? It wouldn't work out. So these numbers in Numbers and Exodus, they only add up if the biblical census numbers are right. There is a possibility, though, that there's been some editing going on, and they combined these numbers at some point, and then later somebody went and fixed the tax number to match, right? Or they wrote that part later, right? That's a possibility. How that would fit with the idea of some kind of biblical inerrancy is tougher to think about. The other possibility is that this number of 603,550 is not meant to be a literal number, right? But it's some sort of figurative thing, using this sort of numerology sort of thing that they practice, where they would equate words with numbers, right? And so 603,000 is equivalent to something like the sons of Israel, or the people of Israel, right? If you add up the letters in that, you get this other number. So it's basically using a number in place of a phrase symbolically. And that's not completely unheard of, maybe, but that seems to be a later thing. And again, it's a possibility, but maybe it's not quite right. On the other hand, though, trying to consider whether the numbers are accurate, we have these archaeological estimates, right? That the population of Canaan is just in the tens of thousands, right? 50 to 70,000, right? Not 10 or 100 times that. If you've got 600,000 guys coming in, or you've got 2 million people moving into the land of Canaan, that's a lot more, right? Where are those people living at? Something's maybe wrong with that. Also, Numbers 3:43 says that there were 22,273 firstborn males in Israel at the Exodus, right? And that's part of a story where it's saying, okay, there's that many firstborn males, and then there's 22,000 Levites. And so we're going to take the Levites in place of the firstborn males, and there's 273 left, and they have to pay the 5 shekel tax, right? And that's interesting with that connection with the Levites. But there's this other thing, though, that if there's 22,000 firstborn males, right, but there are over 600,000 men in the population, plus boys, right? I don't know how many boys. What do you say? 80 boys, or 200,000 boys. I don't know. But that means that there's only one firstborn for every 30 guys or 40 guys, or that's a big problem, right? And we would assume, that the number of firstborn males and firstborn females is going to be the same, right? The number of men and women is going to be roughly equal because it's genetically 50-50, right? So what's going on there, right? That means that if these are all the firstborn, then that means the families have like 30 kids or 60 kids for one set of parents, and that this doesn't make any sense, right? So something seems wrong about that number, right? Now there are some possibilities with that, and that's that for whatever reason, some of the firstborn males might have died, right? Or the ratio of boys to girls was off. Was there some environmental factor? We know there were some issues with boys being thrown into the Nile, right? That's part of the story. How many firstborn males were killed in that way? Don't know, right? There are some possibilities, right, to explain this big difference, but it does kind of add into this idea that maybe the population was a lot less, right? That the number was somehow corrupted, but really the number of the Exodus was more closer to 50,000 or 100,000, not 2 million, right? And there's a lot of debate about that, about which one is right, how do we interpret this, which one fits best with the archaeological evidence, which one, what are the implications of them all, right? Because there's archaeological implications, there's scriptural implications, there's our understanding of how the Bible came to be written. All these things kind of factor into it, right? And so did this get written down and then somebody edited it and changed it later because they thought it was a mistake, or because they were covering something up? Is there good reasons for it, bad reasons for it? There's a long discussion that you could have about all of that, and so there is some difficulty there, right? But there are possibilities for interpreting it that are perfectly legitimate for the most part. But it does, in a lot of ways, come down to faith, right? And what you're willing to believe as a possibility, right? And then, of course, archaeological estimates could be wrong. These guys say, "Oh, there's only this many people there." Well, maybe that's right. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe your method of counting doesn't reflect, a lot of these other people. Like we said, the Israelites are kind of tent-dwelling, nomadic people. They're not living in the cities. They're living in caves and living in, all these things. So if you're just counting cities, maybe you're missing a lot of people, right? But, other things like the Amarna tablets, those do lead us to think that maybe there was a smaller group. Because some of them, I think, are asking for like 20 archers. They're asking the Pharaoh for help, for, send us 20 archers. Well, 20 archers isn't going to do anything against 600,000 people, right? Or 50,000 people you're fighting against. But it might do something to even the odds if there's 1,000 people against you, in a certain place. So there's some question about that, right? Also, there are some pretty simple things. If you don't consider miraculous factors, right? God helping the people get through the desert, right? The Red Sea opening up, the food that they have, coming down from heaven, right? People say, oh, the wilderness couldn't possibly support 2 million people for any amount of time, right? Well, you don't have bread falling from the sky, and God producing water, just to feed them. Well, of course, then they're not going to survive. But if you do have those things, then it's totally possible, right? And so we got to think about that, right? And again, these are tent-dwelling people, right? Moving through this time period. How are you supposed to know where they were last week, much less 3,000 or 4,000 years later, right? It's not an easy question. Right? There's no very clear answers to some of these things. Now, if we look also at the Exodus and we consider the route that they took, right? Where did they cross the sea? Right? I got some ideas here. You might say, where did they cross the sea? Where is Mount Sinai? Where is Kadesh Barnea? Think about Egypt and the land of Goshen being kind of the eastern delta, right? Some people say, oh, they could have gone this way up the road. Well, that's the way of the Philistines. That's the way they didn't go. Okay, some people say they would cross the bitter lakes here. Well, that doesn't quite make sense either, because that's where, that's really close by. The Egyptian army could have just gone around to the other side and just waited for them to cross. Why did they follow them through the sea? That doesn't make sense. But the traditional route has them going down and into the Sinai Peninsula and going to Mount Sinai down there in the middle of that thing. That's why it's called the Sinai Peninsula. That's where St. Catherine's Monastery is, and things like that. And then they place Kadesh Barnea. You can kind of see it up here in the middle of the map in the wilderness of Zin. But there are some problems with that, right? Some big problems with this map. This kind of crossing doesn't really match what the Bible says happened, right? It doesn't match the timing of the routes and the locations of things. Mount Sinai being here in the Sinai Peninsula, as we go back and look at ancient writers and things, they put it over here in the land of Midian, right? Midian's on the other side of the in Arabia, right? This idea of Kadesh Barnea, right? This is within the boundary of Judah. This is in the Promised Land. How could they go and be in the Promised Land before they can go into the Promised Land? That kind of doesn't make any sense, right? But if we consider some other possibilities, right? That God helped them to escape from Goshen, right? And they went all the way down this long beach area here, down the Sinai Peninsula, what we now call the Sinai Peninsula, but the wilderness of Egypt, right? Egypt was, in control of a lot of this area, right? Egypt had copper mines and military posts and things down in this place. And we have evidence of the earliest alphabetic inscriptions were in these places down here, where things were, where there were slaves working in mines and things, and that's another bit of thing maybe we could talk about. But as they run down here, this is just a wide beach. Now it's a long way, right? You might say, how can they just make it down there in such a short time, right? But again, if we're considering that God miraculously helped them, right? That it says, they went without stumbling, right? That they their shoes didn't wear out, their clothes didn't wear out for all this time. Then things start to make more sense, right? That they make this long journey down here. They get trapped by the mountains, and they can't go back, and the army's able to come down and trap them here, and then they cross the sea at the Straits of Tiran down in the south. And then they go over to Mount Sinai in Arabia, which is where the Muslims say Mount Sinai is. They have the cave of Jethro there. This is the area where Josephus and a lot of guys in the first century put Mount Sinai. They said it was the tallest mountain in that area. There's a lot of reasons to consider that Mount Sinai is actually in Arabia and not in what we know as the Sinai Peninsula, because the current place where most Bible maps put Sinai was not done until the time of Constantine, right? When his mother Helen wanted this monastery there in 325 AD. That's Mount Musa. And then the route, right, that they went, they traveled in the wilderness and they came to Ezion Geber, which we know where that is. That's in the land of Edom. They went up to Kadesh Barnea, and see Kadesh here on this map is off to the side, right? It's at Petra, right? It's not in the Promised Land. It's outside of the Promised Land. And so they spent some time in the wilderness around there, and then went back down to Ezion Geber and went up and came into the so the wilderness time was in and around here at Kadesh. And then they came up on the east side of the Jordan and crossed in. And that kind of makes sense. And the routes and the difficulty. This guy at BibleCA.com, Steve Rudd, he's done a lot of work on this, trying to figure out what the route is, what makes sense based on what the Bible says, the different breakups of the route. It doesn't have them crossing all these difficult mountain ranges and all sorts of stuff multiple times in ways that don't match. But again, some of it you have to, if you don't believe in miracles, well, this can't happen, right? Of course they can't cross the sea here. Of course they can't go that far that quickly. But if you do believe that the Bible is what it says it is, this is one of the best candidates for the Red Sea crossing and for Mount Sinai. Now, if we go on a little bit more, just a couple more things to note. Our last slide. This tabernacle that they built, right? That is commanded to be built in the book of Exodus. These mobile tabernacle-like shrines were used in Egypt. They were common in this very period in Exodus. In fact, Thutmose III had one at Karnak before transitioning it to a stone temple, right? So we saw that picture on the wall in the tomb of the vizier, right? That was them making the bricks for the temple at Karnak. So while they were building that, there was a tabernacle there, very similar to the one that Moses was going to build later on, right? And eventually, once he had the stuff, he converted it to stone, stopped using the tabernacle and had a stone temple instead. And this is what Moses does, the same kind of thing in the wilderness. King Tut, also, when we look at his tomb, about 100 years afterwards, right? There's two examples in there, very much like the Hebrew tabernacle. There's a silver trumpet in there, which is one of the things they used at the tabernacle. There's an ark with poles on it. There's a lot of imagery that's very similar to the descriptions of cherubim. Now, these are some interesting questions, like why is the Israelite religious stuff so similar to what we see in Egypt, right? That's an interesting question, right? But it shows that historically, the things that are being recorded in Exodus match very much with what we see in Egypt at that time when we would expect it to be happening, right? It doesn't match hundreds of years later, 1,000 years later in the Babylonian or Persian time. That's not what was going on at that time. These are 13th, 14th century BC artifacts, right? These things going on at that time in that place, right? And so it matches. Now that, again, it gives us a good question. Why are they making something almost like what was in Egypt? It's kind of interesting that God would use that. That might lead to some other questions, but it does indicate that there is a historical connection between the biblical account and what was really going on at that time, right? And that's what we're trying to show, right? That we can rely on these documents to be historically reliable documents because they're talking about things that really did exist, things that make sense for that time period. So we've got one more lesson to do next time. It will be our 13th and final lesson in this series, and we'll go back and look at the time of the patriarchs and before that, what we can say about Noah and the creation story and those sorts of things. But that will be the end, and we'll be done. So thank you very much for your time.